On the early mornings of November 13th, 2022, a suspect entered a home that was rented by University of Idaho students. That suspect went on to kill Casey Gonzalez, Maddie Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin. Now, we did come to find out that the prime suspect in this case was Brian Koehberger. Brian Koehberger is currently set to go on trial in October of 2023. Now, before we get into that, hit that like button down below, hit that subscribe button, and welcome back to my channel, True Crime. I'm your host, Tim Solberg. We've covered this case in depth. We've looked at the house, we've looked at the victims, we've also looked at the suspect, Brian Koehberger. We've even peeled back some of the onion on Ann Taylor, who represents Brian Koehberger currently. A couple of things that we know: the judge is pushing forward to start the trial in October. Now, the defense team is trying everything they can to bring into question the arrest of Brian Koehberger. So let's just talk about Brian Koehberger for a moment, and then we'll jump into the things that I think the prosecution is going to have to prove and why I think the strategy of the defense is going to be to disprove these next 5 things. First and foremost, who's leading the case right now? Is it Ann Taylor, or is Brian Koehberger pulling the strings in the background and trying to give Ann Taylor the strategy on how to move forward in the case? If Brian Koehberger is the one that is coming up with the strategy, we know that he's got the background in criminal justice to be able to come up with that strategy. And we're also searching out there right now on, was there any other crimes that Brian Koehberger had committed? Now, a lot of the FBI profilers are saying that it would be really hard for somebody to go in and commit this type of murder with this many people without committing a crime prior to this. So will that play a factor in this case? And or are we going to find out that Brian Koehberger was responsible for more of the murders? It'll also be interesting to see what kind of objections come out of the defense team, because we're already seeing this pre-trial with the grand jury indictments. We're seeing it with the DNA evidence. We're even seeing it with the arrest. And we're seeing it with the alibi. The prosecution has asked that the defense comes forward with the alibi in early September, so that way they can prepare their evidence to go after that alibi or proceed from there. A couple other things that I want to highlight before we even get into trial is, will Brian Koehberger ask for a bench trial as opposed to a jury of his peers? Would that be a good strategy? Or do you think it would be a lot easier to prove reasonable doubt with a jury of his peers? And then the last piece before I jump into the items that I think the defense is going to go after is there really going to be jurors don't know this case or haven't spent a lot of time researching this case? That'll be very interesting, and that could come up in appeals. So the 5 things that I think the prosecution is going to go after and the defense is prepared for right now is: number 1, the alibi; number 2, DNA evidence; number 3, telecommunications or towers, cell phone evidence; number 4, eyewitness; and number 5, stalking, aka following somebody on Instagram. Okay, so the first one I want to jump into is the alibi itself. So right now we know that the defense has said that the alibi for Mr. Brian Koehberger is that he was driving around by himself during the time of the murders. Now, if you look at the arrest affidavit, it does say that cell phone towers have pinged Brian Koehberger in and around the house prior to the night of the murders. As a matter of fact, he did receive a ticket 2 miles away from the house, so that does prove that he was in the vicinity several times before the murders took place. Now, they also have surveillance video that shows what appears to be his car in and out of the frames several times on the night of the murder. So what I would do as a defense attorney, and I think what the defense is going to do here, is say that the pattern of Brian Koehberger was to be driving around at this time of night, and they're going to bring or introduce evidence that's going to show why he was doing that. We don't know why. Maybe it was something to clear his head. Maybe it was something to help him study better. Whatever the case might be, this is what the defense is going to be preparing for right now. Now, on the other hand, the prosecution is going to have to come after this very hard and say, this is the behavior of somebody that is stalking somebody specific. And they're going to tie it back to my number 5, which would be the stalking. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. So unless the defense comes with a clearer alibi in the early parts of September, this one is going to be very interesting to prove in court. Now, I would say that the alibi, if they come up with a sound alibi, would be the one that would get Brian Koehberger off the easiest. Not the easiest to prove, but if they could prove an alibi and they could prove that he wasn't in the area, which it doesn't look like they can at this point, it would get Brian Koehberger off. All right, number 2, the DNA evidence. Now, this is all over the arrest affidavit. There has been a huge fight in court over this, and a lot of it has to do with how the DNA evidence was attained. Now, the first thing I want to do is just talk about this a little bit. I am going to put a link down below in the comments that's going to really highlight the difference between a forensic lab and the difference between like the genealogy stuff that when you do like 23andMe, things like that, and what that looks like from a DNA perspective. Now, we know that the DNA that was pulled for Brian Koehberger was actually pulled of his dad, and then it went down the family tree, and it basically said one of the children of Brian Koehberger's dad would have committed this crime, and it would be somebody that was male. So we know that. That's going to come out in court, right? Now, obviously, when he was arrested, they're going to take his DNA, but can the defense get this thrown out based off of how it was obtained? Number 2, the court system has only really been using this type of evidence since 2018, the whole family tree thing. Now, there's a lot of flaws with this. Now, not the DNA evidence itself, but how it basically comes up with who is your ancestors, right? Now, this is where it gets a little confusing, so I'm going to try to simplify this as much as I can. I would highly suggest you click on the link down below so you can read into it a little bit further and really understand the differences. So in forensic DNA, they're comparing the DNA strands and all the double helix and all that type of stuff. In this one, when they take your DNA, it's the same DNA, but in order to find out who your relatives are, they have to go based off a database. And essentially, your relatives would have to have their DNA in there as well. Now, there's a little bit of a difference because they are using a forensic lab in this, but this is how they pulled that DNA. The defense can say that this is not a really great way to pull DNA evidence because maybe DNA got mixed up somewhere. Maybe it didn't get sent right. Maybe somebody else swabbed their cheek. Whatever the case might be, I think that this could come into question later on as courts try to struggle with how do they monitor this type of DNA evidence. They've already tightened it up in 2020, 2021. They already decided that this DNA evidence would only be used in violent crimes such as this. And they're trying to protect the privacy of citizens. So does a later court that goes in front of the Supreme Court wipe out the DNA evidence altogether that was found in this case? Now, would that be the case for this going into trial? Not so much, but if this is the sole reason why Brian Koehberger gets convicted, could this get reversed at a later date? Something for you folks to think about. I'm no DNA expert, I'm no legal expert, and this is not legal advice, but I would encourage you to check out that link. A lot of great information there, and it'll kind of give you a little bit more of insight of what the defense was really trying to do. So the third thing is the cell phone towers. Now, I worked in telecommunications for the better part of 16 or 17 years, and I still don't understand telecommunications altogether, okay? So I'm not going to try to be the expert, even though that's my background. I was not a technician. I was not the one that could do cell phone pings or anything like that. I was always on the sales, the marketing, and the operational side. So I'll be very clear on that. Everything that I'm going to discuss here is from my own personal research, and I would not be an expert witness in court. So I want to lay that out there first. But what I will say is that my experience is the cell phone pings are not 100% accurate. And what I mean by that is it can give you an approximation based off triangulation of several towers, right? And it can be accurate up to 3 or 4 addresses or 3 or 4 houses. This is basically going to say, was the car close that night? And if it was, it doesn't actually ping GPS right into the house, right? So they're going to give an approximation. And that's going to be really interesting because a jury might see like, yes, he was in the area, but based off of what we found with the DNA, based off of what we found with the alibi, was it him that did this? Now, another thing that could be stated is that was he in the house ever before? We know that there was parties at the house, and is he going to come out with part of the defense that maybe he had attended a party at a previous time? Okay, so this will be very interesting, and this is going to be very either damning evidence or it's going to put a lot of doubt into the jury. Now, if it's a bench trial, a judge might understand this a little bit better, and it might be harder for Brian Koehberger to prove his way out of this. Okay, so it'll be interesting to see who they bring in as the experts and what that looks like during the case. Number 4, the eyewitness. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, why would the eyewitness be number 4 instead of number 1? Well, pretty easy. If you look at the arrest affidavit, it does say that Dylan had saw somebody coming out that was dressed in black, but their mouth and nose was covered by a mask, okay? So the testimony that's going to come out here is going to be picked apart really fast because anybody that has partial face covered by a mask is going to have a hard time identifying who is behind that mask unless they know that person. And even in that case, is there a chance that they could be wrong? I think in this case here, what the defense is going to do is going to try to make Dylan relive that night and question herself while she's on the stand, if she even comes to the stand. And I think it's going to be risky for the prosecution to put her on the stand for those reasons alone. This would have had to have been devastating for Dylan, right? This would have had to have been something that she's going to live on for the rest of her life and has probably played through over and over in her mind. And that's going to be a hard thing for somebody like that to go on the stand. And I don't know if I'm friends or family with Dylan, if I would want her to relive that. And I don't know if I'm the prosecution, if I would want to open her up to having cross-examination from the defense team. Now, it is the right of Brian Koehberger to face his accuser, and I do totally agree with that, but I think this is one that may not show up in court based off of how gruesome that crime was. And for the victim in here, would it reopen some wounds that to relive that night? Now, what I could see is the judge saying, hey, we're going to allow her to put her testimony in video and we'll play that video to the court. And I think you would see a battle right prior to that being played in court between the prosecution and the defense, both arguing why it should be played and why it shouldn't be played. And ultimately, that'll be up to a judge to see if it's played at all. Now, the last thing that we hear is the stalking claims. And a lot of this is coming from the Instagram, right? So he was following one of the victims on Instagram. And we're going to hear that in this trial a lot. And that does kind of tie back to him being close to the house and what were his patterns prior to these 4 students dying. The thing that I think is going to get disproved very quickly by the defense team is that anytime somebody is on social media, whether it's here on YouTube, whether it's on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, people can go ahead and follow. And yes, they can send messages, and people do all the time. People want to know different things, right? Doesn't mean that there is ill intent when they do that. Now, the question will become how many people were following the person that they're highlighting, and are they going to be able to vet every one of those people? And that is going to bring in reasonable doubt. Now, a jury might see it differently when you stack all of this stuff, because it does really point towards Brian Koehberger, but a good defense team might be able to overcome that. And if they can overcome those 5 pieces of evidence, it's going to be very hard for a jury to go beyond reasonable doubt in this case, I think. Now, with those 5 pieces, I want to hear from you. Is there other things that you think will be presented in court that could sway the case one way or another? We'll talk a little bit about the murder weapon. There hasn't been a murder weapon that's been found. They find a knife sheath with DNA on it, but they don't actually find the knife. So how do they know that that was actually the knife that was used, that was part of that knife sheath? They compare it to the wounds, yes, but how many of those knives that belong to that sheath could have been sold? So that's going to come up in court, but I don't think that's going to be a highlight in the trial. I think that you're going to see that for maybe an hour, hour and a half with some of the DNA experts and from some of the investigators, but I don't think that's going to be a major highlight like the 5 that I pointed out. Again, I want to hear from you folks. Is there other things that we're missing that we think that's going to come up in this trial? Or do you think at the end of the day, what Brian Koehberger is trying to do right now is come forward and take a plea deal and take the death penalty off of the table? Do you think that there's other plays that he's trying to come up with to try to get out of this? Or do you think that he thinks that he's smart enough to get away with this? Again, that would be assuming that he is guilty. Like we've stated before, everybody's innocent until they're proven guilty. It just is a mountain of evidence that's pointing towards Brian Koehberger, but there really is no smoking gun other than that DNA profile that I think has a 50-50 chance of getting thrown out of court. So based off of that, if you stayed with me this long, hit that subscribe button down below. Leave a comment, hit that like. We want to hit those YouTube algorithms. We really want to push our way to get to 1,000 subscribers this year, get monetized, and really work towards making this a full-time job in the next 3 to 5 years. I can do that with your help. Your subscribe means so much. I will say the last few videos, I appreciate everybody that put comments on there. We are changing the look. If you see, I've moved my camera a little bit. We are gonna add a logo to the back in the next couple of videos. It might be a month or 2, and we're gonna rebrand some of the stuff on the channel, so I hope you're excited for that. I am looking for a new name from TrueCrime. We did look at maybe doing something like the 49%, because 49% of murders go unsolved. We want to come up with something that really represents this channel. We also have our mascot, Max, which you've seen in the background before, my Doberman. We've got 3 dogs, but Max is really the crime-fighting dog, so you're going to see him in our logo as well. So if you're with me this long, leave a comment down below. What would you think that a cool name would be for the channel? What other things can we do to improve the videos? Is there other content that you would like to see, or are there any cases that you would like for us to cover? That being said, I hope everybody has a wonderful week this week. I think it's going to be a fantastic week for everybody. I look forward to seeing you on the next video. I'm your host, Tim Sahlberg. Over and out.